Well, good morning, everybody, and it's great to be with you. Thank you very much for inviting me to come and contribute to this Affinity Day. Thank you, Graham, and all the others for organising it and participating in it. I've got a fairly limited task in my first session. I'm thinking about the whole question of whether we should submit to authorities, in what circumstances we should refuse to submit to authorities. So a fairly narrow but important theological question that's of practical relevance at this time. If you've got a Bible or a device, you might want to find Romans 13 because I'll be referring to it. That will be a main text. There's no doubt that in the last 7 months of this coronavirus crisis, the government has exercised legislative, executive and judicial power in a way that has restricted churches. As we enter into the autumn period, it seems that many of the restrictions are beginning to be reimposed, and the likelihood seems to be more restrictions are to come. Well, how have churches reacted to the law and guidance that government has introduced or recommended? Well, the reality is that the vast majority of churches have fully obeyed the law and guidance. My estimate, about 99%, have been in full compliance to what the government has asked for. Some have sought to push the limits to be able to do as much as they're able to do. Some have obeyed the law but decided that they're not going to comply with the guidance. A very small number of denominations went further and imposed more restrictions than even the government was requiring. There are many who've objected to the law and the guidance, some quite strongly, but they haven't carried that through into action. There are a small number who've chosen to disobey, and there are some vocal voices calling for what you might call the full John MacArthur as the right response to the current situation. So there's a variety of Christian views. For some, they see the law and guidance as a necessity in the health emergency. For some, they view it as tyranny. And for others, they see it as evidence of a deep conspiracy. There's clearly growing controversy amongst Christians, divisions in churches, in leadership teams. Some are throwing accusations of cowardice at others or of being unbiblical. So how do we respond to this? Well, what I want to do is just to try to address biblically the question of how we relate to authorities. And three big principles, I think. The first of those is this: the Bible commands Christians to submit to public or community authorities. The Bible commands Christians to submit to public or community authorities. It seems to me that that has to be the positive starting point before we even leap to the question of when we might choose to disobey or not submit. That's the consistent teaching of the Old Testament and the New Testament. It's the teaching of Jesus to give to Caesar what is due to Caesar. It's clearly the teaching of Paul. It's in Romans 13, it's in Titus, it's in 1 Timothy chapter 2. It's the clear teaching of Peter in 1 Peter chapter 2. So we must start, I think, with the positive command that we are commanded to submit to the authorities that are placed over us. The key passage is Romans 13, 1-7. Because of time, I'm not going to read it. I'll presume you've got an element of familiarity with it. But you'll know the context in Romans 13 is the church in Rome at the time of the Roman Empire. It's a mixed church of Jews and Gentiles, and it seems that the immediate background is the growing Jewish rebellion. And Paul is concerned for the implications for the church in Rome if the church gets drawn into this rebellion that's being mounted against the Roman authorities. After all, in a decade or so before, Claudius had expelled the Jews and Christians because of controversy. So Paul's teaching here was of crucial importance both for evangelism and the freedom of the church. The church hadn't yet been prohibited. And so Paul urges the Christians to submit to the authorities, to not be rebels against them. And you get exactly the same context in 1 Peter chapter 2, where the emphasis on submission is because of the evangelistic testimony of the church in the community. So in Romans 13, verse 1, the command is straightforward: let everyone be subject to the authorities. The idea of being subject or submitting means to be put under the authorities. It involves obeying them, it involves respecting them, it involves honouring them. And what's clear is that Jews and Gentiles alike are to submit to the authorities. It's the whole church that's commanded to submit. Why is the church commanded to submit? Well, Paul says it's because of God's sovereignty. He is the one who's established the authorities. That's again clear from the Old Testament. Daniel, God gives the kingdoms of men to whoever he chooses. Secondly, it's because the authorities are God's servant. They are there to promote the common good. Authorities are put in place by God to prevent anarchy and establish order in society. The opposite to the order that authorities brings is the anarchy of the book of Judges, where everybody does what is right in their own eyes, and there is no king. In the context of Romans 12 to 16 more widely, I think this teaching in Romans 13 reminds us that a right attitude to public authorities is actually part of our worship to God. We worship God by submitting to authority. We're called not to conform to the pattern of this world, but to be living lives that are holy and pleasing. And our submission to authorities is part of that. It's an outworking of our love of neighbour. That's what Romans 13 goes on to speak about. And so Paul says in chapter 5, verse 5, that submission is demanded by conscience. And what Paul means by conscience there is not personal, internal moral compass. The Bible doesn't really speak of conscience as an internal moral compass. Rather, more conscience in the Bible means something more like consciousness. What Paul is saying, now you know that the authorities are established by God as his servants for his purpose, you are obliged to submit to them. So there's the first biblical principle. I think the positive and overriding biblical principle, we're commanded to submit to the authorities. Let me just pause for the implications of that. That means that it's therefore sinful not to submit to the authorities and obey them. It is sinful not to show them the respect and honour that they are due. The command to obey is not limited to an idealised form of government. Christians differ over the model of government. The Bible, it seems to me, doesn't lay down a binding model between democracy or monarchy, big or small government. And most of the ideals of government we have are actually pragmatic reactions to seek to balance freedom and order in society. But the command to obey is not limited to an idealised form of government, nor is it limited to our view of the state's competency. Many think from a Christian perspective, the state doesn't have the right to intervene in various areas of life, home, family, church. But the state does possess coercive power. And therefore, the right question is not to ask, what should the state do? The state has acted. And in this crisis, churches have had to come to terms with the fact that the state has done things. It has legislated it. It has taken executive action. The question in that context becomes, would obedience require me to sin? So I'm thinking about the contemporary context. It seems to me that the government has acted to protect public health. When you look at the Old Testament background, it seems that the civil law certainly included dealings with issues of health and safety, building regulations, quarantines, infectious diseases, a law of negligence and not harming others. That's part and parcel of the comprehensive vision of the Old Testament law. It doesn't seem to me that the government has been acting in bad faith. It doesn't seem to me that it's been dictating the doctrine of the church and imposing it on the church. It's not prevented the practice of faith and worship in totality. There are plenty of places we can continue to worship. We can't meet as we might have wanted to or as we did before, but we've not been banned from worshipping or meeting or engaging. And the restrictions have been limited and temporary. A couple of cultural observations about how Christians have responded. It seems to me the response to the regulations and law has often reflected your individual personal political philosophy. Those who have most objected to the law and guidance tend to be those who've got a right-wing libertarian philosophy, perhaps influenced by a kind of a Reagan-Thatcher model of small state and small government. The attitude would be reflected towards a health and safety culture more generally, and a view that people should be allowed to take their own risks. It seems to me there's also a warning here for us of how Christians have been deeply affected by postmodernism, and we've become suspicious of all authority, and basically don't wish to be under any authority. There's a hostility and a distrust. And I wonder if that is really consonant with a sort of Christian heritage from the past. It seems to me that we've in danger of forgetting our obligation to show respect and honour. You read some of the articles in the press, you read much of the debate on social media, and honouring and respecting government that bears a heavy responsibility and is facing a difficult job is often not the tone with which people speak. So the Bible commands us to submit to authority. Secondly, second important principle, the Bible command to submit is not a command to support. The Bible command to submit is not a command to support. And I think it's essential we make this distinction. We're commanded to submit, to accept authority and obey, but that doesn't mean we're commanded to support and agree with what the government commands. So in responses to the coronavirus law and guidance, it's possible to be Christians and believe you've got a duty to disobey. It's possible to believe that you can disagree, but also have a duty to obey, or it's possible to obey because you agree with what is introduced. And Christians will be in all three of those categories. But it doesn't seem to me the command to submit is actually a command to support, and Christians are entitled to engage with public authority in a wide variety of ways. As Christians, we're entitled to insist on our rights, the rights that the public authority grants us, and we're entitled to enforce those rights. So, for example, Paul exercised his rights as a Roman citizen. In the book of Acts, the church argued that it was a permitted religion under Roman law, not an illegal sect. And it's perfectly appropriate for Christians to challenge the coronavirus law and guidance if they believe it is unlawful or ultra vires within the state. When the restrictions were originally introduced, there was a Muslim who sought judicial review of the lockdown on the grounds that it was disproportionate to her health crisis. That's a perfectly legitimate response, exercising the legal and constitutional rights we have. The case was lost because he didn't make it out that the lockdown was disproportionate, so his freedom of religion didn't trump the health crises. In the US, we see the same thing happening with Capitol Hill Baptist Church, who are asserting their rights under the American Constitution to argue against the lockdown restrictions that have been imposed, whilst at the same time obeying those lockdown restrictions. So we have the right to insist on our rights. In a democratic society, we have sort of options that are not available to those in non-democratic societies. We're entitled to persuade the government to change its policy, to lobby, write to newspapers, petition, contact our MPs, and to encourage others to do the same. It's important that we can engage in that protest, but I think it needs to be done in a way that reflects that respect and honour that we're commanded to give to the authorities. We're entitled to protest. Within our democratic system, there is the right of public protest, lawful demonstrations, marches. It's a little bit more complicated in our society because there's also a kind of a historic tradition of peaceful protest, sit-ins, trespasses, which are in one way unlawful, but are regarded as a legitimate part of the political process. The line is crossed once one's into the area of criminal damage, riot and violence. And we've seen all of these tensions worked out in, for example, the Black Lives Matter demonstrations. And of course, supremely, you have the right to protest by voting against the government in an election and removing them from power. And finally, it seems to me we're obliged to speak prophetically. The task of the church is to speak prophetically, to call for justice, to warn of judgment, to point to Christ. And that is the key task of the church. So the command to submit is not a command to support. We have the right to persuade, protest, to speak prophetically. Finally, and I think it's important that we come to this last, finally, the Bible tells us that we're commanded to disobey if obedience would be sinful. We're commanded to disobey if obedience would be sinful. There's not an absolute command to loyalty. God is supreme over the public authorities. Where there's a conflict of loyalty, loyalty to Christ must prevail, and we are to disobey rather than sin. And again, there are examples running through the Old and New Testament. The Hebrew midwives in the book of Exodus, Rahab and the Israelite spies, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who refused to bow down to the golden statue, Daniel, who refused to stop praying, the apostles in Acts chapter 5, who refused to stop speaking in the name of the Lord Jesus, the early Christians who refused to worship the emperor as Lord. But it seems to me, as we think these passages through, the key principle is this: would it be sin to obey the authorities? Would it be sin to obey the authorities? In the end, it's not simply a matter of preference or the assertion of a principle of liberty. Many public authorities grant individuals more freedom than the Bible requires. I think that's a good thing, but the infringement of political liberty is not a grounds for disobedience biblically. The only liberty we have the right to insist on biblically is the liberty not to sin. And so therefore the question is, would obeying government be to disobey Christ and to sin? And I think that works through, we can see that in a number of areas in contemporary society. This is becoming more and more of an issue as society begins to regulate more and more, and it's a post-Christian secular society. Smacking is now against the law in Wales and Scotland. Should Christians disobey the law and smack their children? Well, yes, if they believe that not smacking their children is sinful, but that's where the question has to land. Equalities law, is it sinful to supply goods and services to people in a same-sex relationship? Hate speech, is it sinful not to use hate speech to preach the gospel or extreme language? Face coverings. You may not want to wear a face covering. You may not want to be forced to wear a face covering, but are you sinning by wearing a face covering? There's a key difference between our preferences, our feeling that we ought to be allowed liberty, and the question of whether we are being obliged to sin. We live in a culture in which government has given us wide freedoms to exercise preferences, and it's natural to want to defend those. But that is not the same as being entitled to disobey when some of those freedoms are taken away. So as we think about this whole area, it seems to me that most of the disagreements between Christians in the end are not over these theological principles, they're actually over the question of what God requires of his people. Churches have been shut in the context of a health emergency. In that situation, is it sinful not to meet as a whole gathered congregation, no matter what its size? Is it sinful not to be able to gather as 6,000 people on a Sunday morning? Very few people I've heard have argued that it would be sinful not to meet, no matter the circumstances, no matter the risk of the virus, no matter how many people would die. I haven't heard people arguing for an absolute principle that in every circumstance, they should be entitled to meet no matter what the state says. So it becomes an issue of then judgment. Singing in church, a matter of strong guidance under the coronavirus guidance. We're told that we can't sing corporately, but does that mean that we are sinning? You can listen to others sing, you can listen to recorded music, you can have a small choir sing, you can hum, you can say words in a normal voice, you can sing at home, you can sing in the garden with your household and with other people who meet up with you, you can sing along in your own heart. Given all of that, are we sinning if we don't sing corporately in a particular way? And in thinking these things through, it seems to me that the motivation of government surely matters. Are these measures being introduced for genuine health protection reasons? Are they proportionate to the risk that is faced? If they're not, we can challenge them in judicial review. Are Christians being discriminated against compared to other faiths and other sections of society? Are these measures genuinely temporary, or are they being introduced on a permanent basis in order to restrict the life and worship of the church? Those, it seems to me, are the key biblical principles that we need to be working through. We're commanded to obey the authorities. Submitting to the authorities is not the same as supporting, and we have all sorts of ways of challenging and engaging. But if we're commanded to sin, then we must disobey. Alex, over to you.
Thank you so much, John. Impressively comprehensive. And there are a couple of questions that I had that I almost interrupted you for, and you were answering them right at the end. So thank you for that. There's a particular question, which I won't force you to answer unless you want to add another angle. It says, if the context of Romans 13 was not joining a Jewish revolt, then surely what Paul was thinking of was submission in civil or political matters, not in the area of worship, e.g. fellowship and singing. This seems to be reflected in the example of giving in terms of paying taxes. He does not suggest that they should change the way they worship or gather. Indeed, New Testament Christians suffered so much under these authorities because they did not submit in the area of worship. So should we be saying, actually, we're commanded by God to sing, to gather, to be intimate, and therefore civil disobedience or pushing the guidelines, their absolute limit is appropriate?
I think that's a difficult question. That works out exactly what does God require of us in these kinds of circumstances in the context of a health emergency. I think the principle of submission to the authorities, as I said, unless it's required by God and it would be sinful not to meet, that presupposes it would be sinful not to meet in a particular way during this particular sort of time. And of course, Christians around the world face all sorts of restrictions on what they can do as churches. They might face restrictions on the numbers of people who can meet, the size of building that they can build, the planning regulations that they have. We all face some measure of control over health and safety over our buildings. We in our worship and our church gatherings, we cannot just do as we want. And that's true across a whole variety of areas of our church life and sort of practice. So in countries in which public worship is restricted, Christians don't insist on the right to go out and organise and hold public worship. They meet in private. They do what they are able to do. So we might agree that the state should not restrict church in this way, but when it has done so, the question is, what is our right and proper response to that? And I think it boils down to the question, and I guess the area of disagreement will be there will some who will say it will be sinning not to meet in that way. I think the 99% of Christians who've abided by the law and guidance don't think it's sinning not to meet in that way. And that seems to me the fundamental difference.
So a lot of this is about a judgment call, and what exercising our rights, which many in Paul's day didn't have in terms of good democratic protest and so on. I suppose one of the issues that many who've been pushed into the camp of lockdown skeptic feel frustrated about is that they've been accused of being right-wing libertarians, where there's someone who's not a Christian, Sunepta Gupta, who says she's very left-wing normally, has been accused of this. How do Christians react to being forced into political camps when they're actually just trying to exercise their democratic right of protest? Have you got wisdom on how we speak out?
I think we have to be honest that our views are influenced by our political philosophy and culture. And I think, again, the attitudes that people take towards these kind of lockdown measures, I think often are reflective of attitudes they've taken to other political issues and other political contexts before that. So we need to be honest enough to recognise our innate biases. And I think we need to be fair and recognise that actually Christians are not totally agreed on those things. So many people now are just listening in their social media bubble to the people who agree with them, that they've forgotten that there's a diversity of opinion and not everybody is agreed. And there's a range of political philosophies that are shared by Christians. I think we need to recognise that. As we approach government, I said we've got the right to persuade and the right to protest. I think it is really important in a secular state that we seek to persuade in a way that is winning with the government, simply asserting our rights, stating our own self-importance, differentiating ourselves from other sections of society that are struggling and suffering, not recognising the degree of the challenge, assuming that all the science is very clear that there's no real problem to this kind of virus. I think all of those are in the end unlikely to be effective ways of persuading the sort of public authorities to take a different view. So the kinds of arguments that I think we can make are the benefit that churches bring to society. The way that churches have been absolutely meticulous in seeking to observe guidance and law in order to be COVID safe places. There are ways of making the argument that reflect the challenge that government is facing. I suppose
one of the, let me come back on you. One of the questions people are feeling is not right now. We're able to work things out right now a little bit, but there's this feeling that we're moving towards what philosophers and great Christian leaders sort of prophesied would happen. C.S. Lewis said, "I dread government in the name of science. The more completely we are planned, the more powerful they will be. Why should power not corrupt this time as it has done before?" And he spoke into this age, or Camus said, "The welfare of the people is the alibi of every tyrant." And what if we start to see ourselves feeling a little bit like Bonhoeffer? I read his biography recently, and I was struck by, he pushed so hard. He would have been the equivalent of a massive lockdown skeptic. He alienated a lot of the mainstream church leaders, network leaders. And so they didn't join with him and see the dangers until it was too late. How do those of us who feel this sort of sense of injustice bubbling over, those of us who've seen friends die of suicide and abuse, alcohol abuse or whatever, how do we push back in a way that wins the church together rather than alienates before it's too late?
Well, I have to say, this is an area of debate at the moment on this particular issue. So people feel very strongly their view is right. I read a range of different newspapers, and it's fascinating reading them how convinced they are that their position on the virus is the right position. I think we have to recognise that this is a situation of some considerable uncertainty. All around the world, people are trying to work out what is the right response to that. So I think there's a sort of a humility that needs to come for that in this particular instance. there is debate about the virus, how to respond to it, what is the best thing that government can do. Everybody has to weigh up what's the alternative. So for those who say just simply remove any kind of lockdown because of the people who are suffering other diseases or whatever, well, if you do that and the virus continues, you'll have a whole load of cases of people who are struggling with COVID. So it's not easy. I think a recognition of those challenges and that there's no easy option. I would say in relation to the public sphere, always speak with graciousness and an understanding of the best of those that you're disagreeing with. So take and deal with their best arguments. I think this is often a failing of Christians. We want to go for...
What about in practice? I suppose it's not just about argument. You know, someone saying, what if I feel morally obliged to visit people in depression or suicide?
The law, as far as I understand, already allows you to do that. You can visit care and vulnerable people. And I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding of what the law actually allows, because there are massive exceptions that enable much of pastoral ministry to happen in the way that we would want to. It's the public gatherings of the church that are most impacted, but an awful lot of the work that we're able to do is still permitted under the exceptions that have been granted by government, because they've actually recognised the importance of some of those things. I think how we have our internal debate is very different from the way that we ought to speak externally. It's important the church seeks to speak winningly to wider society. We can have more vociferous debates internally, but when that spills out into the public sphere, I think the danger is we lose our coherency as a community, and we're not likely to be heard in the same way.
Yeah. I think we'll just, in your closing remark, it'd be helpful to get a view. Someone has asked a question, quite specifically to you, John, why didn't you sign that letter? Yep. And it's in the context of the prophetic voice of the church. And yep. Even non-Christians have said, come on, churches, we don't need to know from you just to wash our hands. We need to know how to live in this era. Let's hear you speak out. You talk about meaning. Give us some meaning.
Yeah, I've been asked that question. I did sort of communicate with some of those who'd authored the letter to say why I wouldn't sign it at the beginning. I've said if I'm asked that question, I'm happy to explain. I think if you sign a letter, you have to agree with what it says and the way it says it. For me personally, I felt the letter was asking for something we shouldn't ask for, which is basically no lockdowns at all. I can conceive a circumstance in which it might be right for public health reasons for society to be locked down. I didn't feel I could support something that seemed to be saying that should never be the case. I didn't agree with the argument about the exceptionalism for churches. I think we need to recognise that a whole variety of people in society are suffering because activities they're involved in are being closed down. And personally, I think it's important to recognise the challenge that government is facing. And I think a need to be able to say to government, we really appreciate that this is a massively difficult issue. Boris Johnson, after all, is a natural libertarian, and he's doing things he doesn't want to do because he believes they're in the public interest. So I agreed with about 2/3 of the letter, and I couldn't in conscience agree with the other parts of it. I'm meeting with Lord Greenhalgh, who's the Minister for Faith, on Thursday. Got a Zoom call with him. I'll be pressing many of the points that are pressed in that letter on behalf of churches. I want churches to be allowed to remain open and minister as fully and completely as they can. I think the way that we engage on that issue is important and significant. So I believe in the vital importance of making that case. I just think we've got to be careful we don't make it in a way that ultimately is counterproductive to what it is we want to see in the end.
And thank you so much, John. And thank you for the way you've engaged with me personally as well, and said you'll carry some of those issues in. It's a huge encouragement. We're praying for you. And I mean, there are lots of questions about, I can't visit people in care homes, or I want to visit the vulnerable. I suppose people should get in touch with you, and you can help them communicate those things right into power.
Can I say, I just read the guidance, you can visit the vulnerable. Many care homes are doing, actually I went to see my mother this week, the first time I could see her in 10 months since December. Been in a care home for 10 years. So some of those things can be done. The kind of the current guidance, even for tier 3, grants significant exemptions that enable you to care for vulnerable people, or set up support groups for vulnerable people that can meet in church with groups up to 15. So that there is wide scope, even in what has been kind of put in place by the government, to provide pastoral care and support to the most vulnerable and the most needy in our churches. Again, we'll be pressing that with the minister on Thursday, because I think that is absolutely crucial given the impending mental health crisis that is growing all around us.
Can I have two